On behalf of the panel, I just want to thank David and Breyer and the Mike Center Directorate. Our first two panels today were rich, generative conversations on policy interventions and social media. And now we're kind of looking forward a little bit. So until recently, to speak of the internet after capitalism was anathema. As the fog of neoliberalism recedes from our political imagination, however, new visions of a truly democratic internet are ascendant. This final panel examines how the hyper-commercialized internet came into being and what we must do on the germinations, to build on the germinations of a democratic internet already in existence. With the commercial internet failing and alternatives struggling to be born, what politics are needed to create an actual public internet? With that, I want to introduce our panelists. To my immediate left, Matthew Crain is an associate professor of media and communication at Miami University. His research focuses on the political economy of media, digital advertising, and consumer surveillance. He is the author of Profit Over Privacy, How Surveillance Advertising Conquered the Internet, and he has published articles in academic journals, including New Media and Society and the International Journal of Communication. Next is Moira Weigel, who's an assistant professor at Northeastern University. She studies digital media in a global context, using mixed methods to investigate forms of networked labor, identity, and persuasion, among other topics. Currently, she is conducting a study of transnational e-commerce entrepreneurs, focusing on the experiences of Amazon's third-party marketplace. She is the author of two books, Labor of Love, The Invention of Dating, and Voices from the Valley. Tech workers talk about what they do and how they do it, which she co-edited with Ben Tarnoff. She is also a co-founder of Logic magazine. Ethan Zuckerman is a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where he teaches public policy, communication, and information. Over the years, he has been a tech startup guy, a nonprofit founder and co-founder, and through it all, a blogger. He is the author of two books, Digital Cosmopolitans, Why We Think the Internet Connects Us, Why It Doesn't, and How to Rewire It, and more recently, Mistrust, Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them. And finally, Ramesh Srinivasan is a professor at UCLA. He studies the relationship between technology, politics, and societies across the world, and is the author of three books. Whose Global Village? Rethinking How Technology Impacts Our World. After the Internet, with Adam Fish. And most recently, Beyond the Valley, How Innovators Around the World Are Overcoming Inequality and Creating the Technologies of Tomorrow. His articles and interviews have been published by The Washington Post, Wired, The Economist, The Financial Times, and The New York Times, among others. So Matt, I want to start with you. If a key premise of this space is that the internet is broken in some fundamental way, tell us how we got here, and how does that history inform a deeper analysis of the political economic relations that define the internet today?
Thanks, Sanjay. I just want to say it's really wonderful to be in a room with all of you, and I'm very happy to be here and sharing some of the great ideas. So a lot of my work looks at the commercial development of the early internet, particularly around the construction of the surveillance advertising business model. So I thought I might start with like sketching an ultra brief 30,000 feet history of the net's commercialization, and then suggest some observations from the past that might help us advance the project of reimagining the internet. I want to say at the start that I'm very energized by the anti-monopoly movement that's happening right now as it relates to big tech. This is a real moment of promise, political promise around several fronts. And one thing that anti-monopoly does very well is it foregrounds the idea that the internet is not a technology, really. It's a set of social relations. And as such, it's a problem of institutions, public policy, and political economy. This fact really stands out when you go back and study how the internet was developed. The state of the internet today is largely a result of a discrete set of public policy decisions made in the 1970s, 80s, and 1990s. To paraphrase Tom Streeter, the internet is not something that happened, it is something that was done. So if you know the history of media and communication systems, this is obvious, but I don't think it's obvious to everyone. And there's still a myth that the net is some kind of laissez-faire playground of Silicon Valley geniuses. And that myth goes strong in some quarters because it's useful as a deterrent for reform. So the net comes from tech innovation, yes, but it has always been structured by human beings making policy choices in particular contexts. Of the many policy decisions that were made about the internet, the most important dealt with privatization, who will own the infrastructure, and commercialization, how are profits going to be made from the human activity that occurs on the net's application layer. In other words, the most important choice was, do we hand this over to capital unbridled for profit making, or do we see other goals as being important? There's not much suspense in the room because we more or less know how the story's played out, right? ISPs were given internet service provision to the telecoms, to the cable companies, and then the application layer was open to all comers, with special carve-outs for commerce, no sales tax, and the advertising industry in particular. And the result is that the net has become an increasingly dystopian laboratory of commercial and state surveillance, among other things. So who made these decisions? Elites in federal government in close consultation with private sector trade associations. How and why these decisions were made is a great story with many details that I do not have time to go into, though I can recommend a great book on it if you're interested. But we can boil it down to a mix of genuine uncertainty about what the internet might be, adherence to a market ideology that misunderstands or misrepresented how capitalism actually works, and good old-fashioned political expediency, or what we might also reasonably call anti-democratic policymaking. So in terms of commercialization, the key decade was the 1990s. And for 2 terms, Clinton and Gore, with most legislators, went nearly all in with free market policies. The first principle of the White House's Internet Manifesto was literally the private sector should lead. And they really stuck with it. Fueled by the dot-com bubble and unburdened by public interest obligations, a clumsy internet advertising industry immediately started to track people indiscriminately. The tech was much less sophisticated than what we have right now, but the core idea was pretty much the same. Build surveillance under the justification that you're providing relevant content and subsidizing the free services that could otherwise not be provided. And the advertising itself doesn't actually need to work that well. You just have to convince marketers to spend money, which it turns out is also not that hard. So already by the mid-1990s, companies like DoubleClick, later bought by Google, of course, were tracking huge numbers of internet users. And by the late 90s, a scrappy Beltway activism privacy movement advanced the first political backlash against early surveillance advertising. In fact, there are many examples of resistance and paths not taken in this history. Very early on in the Clinton administration, government analysts at the NTIA warned without privacy laws, the internet was going to be overtaken by data-hungry monopolists. They were right and they were ignored. But it was this group of privacy advocates from civil society that had the most impact in the late 1990s. They fought in the court of public opinion. They wrangled a reluctant Federal Trade Commission to take privacy seriously. They made some allies in Congress. They even got a law passed, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. But it was a weak law, and the privacy activists ultimately lost really badly. Data collection was permitted with little restriction, and after the dot-com bubble crashed, surveillance advertising recovered very quickly under the auspices of Google, Facebook, and other companies that we know. Serious questions about privacy and the broader political economy of the internet fell off the table for about 2 decades until now. I really think we're in a very exciting moment. I think we couldn't even be sitting here having this conversation where we don't have to convince the audience that there's a problem. We know that there's problems. So I want to draw just a couple lessons from this history. There's a lot to be drawn, but I want to just talk about 3 quickly. The first is simple, is we need a movement. Good policy ideas and sharp critiques of commercialism are not enough. Without a social movement and or an acute crisis of some kind, the odds are stacked against good public policy. The US has had a terrible track record of anti-democratic policymaking in communications, particularly, as Patricia Aufderheide notes, the public is endlessly invoked, but rarely is it consulted. So reforming the internet can only happen within a broader democratic, social democratic movement, really. As I.F. Stone put it, the rich march on Washington every day. Which is why I think the anti-monopoly movement is our best iron in the fire right now. Anti-monopoly is a very strong message because it's a connective lens that ties problems with technology to other struggles around inequality, class, and power. It makes a straightforward critique of capitalism that I have to believe a great many Americans feel in their bones at this point. But I want to stress, and this is my second kind of lesson, that anti-monopoly has to be about power. And it has to be about social relations. It can't only be about restoring market competition. And I'm sure that the neo-Brandesians know this as well as anyone. Some of these folks are in the building today, and I want to give them a shout out. You are our modern trust busters. Let's go. But it is a tremendous challenge to wield the legal tools of the New Deal in the world that Robert Bork built, a world where antitrust has been a good friend of monopoly power for over 40 years. So breaking monopoly power is necessary and would provide us tons of benefits, but market competition itself is not likely to solve problems around consumer surveillance or privacy in particular. Excuse me. There was a great deal of competition in the dot-com era when surveillance advertising got started, and one of the main things companies competed about was who could surveil us the best, right? Who can create more invasive models of tracking and increasingly devious attempts to manipulate consumer behavior. It was a competitive race to the bottom. Competition is no panacea. And now my last point, whatever comes next, we need to be extremely wary of advertising. Advertising is a metastatic force. It expands to fill any vessel and it takes over its host. That's because advertising is not just a business model. A business model implies something that can be changed or modified or even jettisoned, but advertising is deeply embedded in American media and communications. Ethan actually wrote a great article a few years ago about advertising as the internet's original sin. But of course, advertising is the original sin of our entire media system. And it's more than a set of business practices that happens on top of a communications infrastructure. Advertising is a fulcrum of capitalism's overarching need to produce consumer demand. So once advertising was unleashed online, it quickly became dominant, it became structural, and communication systems, if they're funded by advertising, they're all the same, insofar as they become organized around serving marketers first and foremost. One argument in support of markets is that they're responsive to consumer demand. The prevailing wisdom is that if people truly desire privacy, competitive markets will deliver it. We should be very skeptical of this claim. It's cliche now, but it was obvious even back in the 1990s. In advertising markets, we're not the customers, marketers are. People argue about what advertising sells. Is it attention or is it something else? The question isn't what advertising sells, it's what is the product and who the paying customers are, really. In ad-supported systems, there's only one answer to who the paying customers are. And as long as advertising is dominant on whatever comes next, we should be very suspicious that markets, even competitive ones, will produce positive social outcomes.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So Moira, so Matt describes the internet as a set of social relations, and social relations are mediated by institutions. That is, institutions determine the modes and distribution of power between distinct social groups. So when it comes to the contemporary internet, how do key market institutions shape the field of power in the digital economy?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? Thank you for setting me up, Sanjay, and thank you. I want to repeat everyone's appreciation for this event and for everyone in the room. And so I'm especially happy to follow both Matt and this question about mediating relations because I think I've been studying Amazon and Amazon's third-party marketplace for the past couple of years, and it's become very clear to me, or a point I keep returning to, is that what we see there is not so much a virtualization of e-commerce a virtualization of commerce, but a remediation of these relations involved in global commerce and retail that have existed for a long time. I was tickled by the anecdote Sandeep shared about someone saying, what, am I supposed to start walking to CVS or Walmart again instead of shopping on Amazon? And I think this kind of anecdote, which I've also heard and thought of myself, gets at this issue that it's not so much the division between on and offline as this way that certain kinds of algorithmic systems and data systems are reorganizing relations that matters. And to Sanjay's question, I think in my work in this area recently, I've been trying to work through or to hold two sort of somewhat contradictory things in mind, which is that the changes that Amazon has wrought to global retail, global supply chains, have in some cases created some new opportunities for some people. And in my research, I've talked to everyone from, petty capitalists from Suzhou or Shandong who now do have, can capture more of the value of the things their factory workers make for the US marketplace through Amazon. Kids who grew up flipping. I have one subject who, as a kid, started flipping sneakers in Cleveland and now by selling them through Amazon and now has a big business. So these are just two examples, but sort of examples of people who have gained access to certain markets and power and wealth through this system that would not have had the same opportunities otherwise, at the same time that, as I suspect everyone in this room probably agrees about, those opportunities build on and reproduce existing inequities in many different ways on local and global scales, and also do this paradoxical thing, I mean, perhaps not paradoxical, but tricky thing of enrolling these small businesses and individuals as agents of Amazon's expansion. I think we have a long tradition and powerful moral imaginary in the US, thinking about small versus big business. As a kid of the 90s, I remember thinking about this with Walmart and Barnes and Noble versus the corner store, but in a way the kind of topology or shapes that we're seeing here are a little bit different than that. It's like these tiny digital outfits that are at once abused by and very dependent on this massive behemoth. So anyway, that just to connect what I'll talk about to Matt's talk and the question you posed. So for the past couple of years, as I said, I've been studying third-party e-commerce, this universe of small businesses and also service providers and software developers and lenders who are involved in supplying the Amazon marketplace. I've lost all touch with how much it's normal to know about this. Do people sort of know what a third-party seller is and know that when you shop on Amazon.com, about 60% of the time or more, that means you're buying from a small business or a third party through Amazon. 50%, over 50% of those businesses are located in China, selling directly to the US marketplace through Amazon's infrastructure. Shockingly, Amazon takes about, there's just a few more numbers, about 55% is the latest data of each sale that those merchants make. That's up from, I think the best estimates were 19% in the early 2010s. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance had a figure of 34% a few years ago. 55 is the newest number. And this world, although it might seem sort of obscure to consumers and is deliberately obscured to consumers, is really central, I argue, to the growth of Amazon's power. The fees that these small businesses pay to use Amazon have consistently been one of the highest revenue sources for the company. The work they do and the risk they bear has been completely central to its global growth. And in many ways, the ad tech products that Amazon develops and even AWS products that they've developed that might seem like some of the flashier parts of the business than merchants selling coats or sneakers are developed in response to the data they gather about these small businesses and to their needs. And so my argument is that these are sort of that by looking at these third parties, it's a way of understanding what Amazon is as a global platform from a different perspective, one that's not dependent on Amazon PR talking to me, because they get a bit upset with me, or have in the past. And also, I hope, a way to tell a story about platform power with protagonists who are not a small number of engineers in Seattle or San Francisco. And these subjects do hold real expertise about the platform. I mean, there's a way that like the single mom I talked to who resells stuff, they call it arbitraging, from Targets and Best Buys around North Carolina, and then resells them on Amazon, really understands the dynamics of global marketplaces and what's cheap where, and when has a Chinese manufacturer come online that's selling stuff cheaply that she used to sell and now she can't turn a profit. So anyway, I'm trying to think about how to use these human stories of dependency on the platform to understand its global scope. So to organize my remarks a bit, I was thinking with Victor's opening provocations, how did we get here? What's going on? Like, what's the internet that's been made? and what would be better? The hard question. I think I've already said a little bit about what it looks like from my point of view. But to speak briefly to the question of how we got here in the world of commerce and e-commerce, as many speakers have been stressing, the power of a firm like Amazon is certainly not inevitable. It's built on many preconditions, which include both sort of the history of globalization that has made it the case that there are all these manufacturers and firms to get online, and of corporate concentration. I always like to remind other people who also write books of this fact, because I think it's so humbling that Bezos early on, supposedly when casting about for ideas about what product category to start with, chose books because 3 of the 4 national distributors were in the Pacific Northwest near Seattle, where they would not have to pay sales tax if they were headquartered, and books are all about the same size and won't break in transit. So they're kind of easy for logistics. There's something I find very humble about that, humbling, as a person who cares about books. But the entire system is built on structures of global capitalism and global supply chains, forms of data integration that Walmart was already doing in the 1980s and 1990s, and in some respects is not new. Of course, Amazon also benefited, as Matt was alluding to, from policy decisions which exempted it from the need to charge sales tax until 2018, and also from product liability and all kinds of other issues that conventional brick and mortar retailers had to deal with. Amazon, too, of course, could access enough capital to build what I often think of as just barely good enough infrastructure to get other people to pay to use it. And I can't overstate how bad some of the Amazon marketplace infrastructure is on the back end, having worked with it now pretty closely. So basically, I think that an important precondition is to think about how is it that a firm like Amazon can get the capital to build this logistics system, which then they can get every aspiring small business, who wants to access the online marketplace to pay for. And I want to stress, too, that that's not just private capital, but in indirect ways, and in some cases direct ways too, state capital, like public resources. I always like to stress small business is a state project. It's supported in both the United States and China, which are the 2 places I mostly look at, and the 2 places that mostly supply Amazon's marketplace, by small business loans, low interest rate loans, in some cases direct subsidies, tax breaks, and so on. So what we're seeing when Amazon takes a 55% cut of every sale is a kind of depressingly familiar form of the upward transfer of public resources that in theory are supposed to be sort of going through small business to redress inequality, right? To give people opportunity. So I've talked a bit about what Amazon's dominance looks like. I'm looking at my notes to see if there's anything I wanted to say that I haven't said. I think the key thing to emphasize is this tricky way that the global reach of a platform like that, which grows to the scale it's at by shifting work and risk onto third parties, does then enroll them in this very ambiguous and sort of conflicted way in the project of making them bigger. And I can't say how many small business owners I've interviewed who've said, I'm trying to sell in other ways, I'm trying to diversify, but I just can't get off Amazon. It's so much of the online marketplace. Sometimes they're scared to sell elsewhere because of rumors they've heard that if Amazon sees them selling elsewhere, they'll punish them in some ways. And anyway, so these subjects are very aware of the contradictions of their position. I think as a provocation that I alluded to earlier, a question I've been kind of wrestling with is how much we should think of Amazon as a separate beast to other kinds of firms. And I alluded to this with the, is the offline-online distinction even that useful in certain ways? Walmart and Target and other big retailers are now imitating Amazon's practices with third parties. And, every coffee shop has an app you can use to order stuff to pick up from it at this point, basically. So I wonder, far be it from me to agree with Amazon's lawyers, but when they say e-commerce is not a distinct category anymore, so we're not a monopoly, there is a small part of me that's like, maybe there is something to that to think with, which of course means not that we should excuse Amazon, but that we have to think about these pathologies of capitalism much more broadly, and not just as a tech problem. So in closing, to this question of what would be better or sort of what should be done, I think it's a very hard question in a lot of ways in this case, and I think it's a particularly hard question in the context folks have alluded to of this sort of anti-China rhetoric and new Cold War, great power struggle, because particularly with the TikTok hearings going on, I mean, I've been thinking about, you know, I don't know, just how politically it can play. It could play out to point out Amazon's reliance on Chinese sellers and small businesses, what the entry of Chinese-owned platforms like Shein and Temu are going to mean in this space in the coming years. So it's a very hard question to navigate politically, I think. So instead, reflecting for today, I was thinking I would focus on sort of what are the positive or utopian or idealist impulses that I see in the community I've been studying and working with, and what sort of contradictions or fractures might be there that might be useful to exploit or think about. And in terms of utopian impulses, I think I'm often struck in this community by the fact that although a certain rhetoric and ideology of entrepreneurship is something that someone like me might be inclined to kind of roll my eyes about a little bit in some cases, it is motivated by the desire for autonomy and dignity in work that is deeply understandable and deeply central, I think, to people's sense of dignity, control over their own lives. And that's particularly true for people who have been historically marginalized in a variety of ways, whether it's women with caring responsibilities who do this because they can't deal with a corporate job, or immigrants or minorities, and so on. And so I think while the model of solving structural inequality with entrepreneurship is flawed in many ways, I think that whatever kind of political solutions to thinking about Amazon's power there might be will involve sort of harnessing and connecting with that desire for dignity, autonomy, creativity in work. In terms of contradictions, I've already talked about this sense of people's pursuit of independence and autonomy being tied so closely with this deep dependency on Amazon's data and infrastructures. I think another contradiction that's very striking is the way in which this system really decouples small business and entrepreneurship from community, from like cities and neighborhoods. And part of why historically people have thought of small businesses as good, I think, is because they perform this community function, which a small business that gets government loans to start selling stuff on Amazon does not do necessarily in the same way. And so that's something to think through. I think there's something about, at the level of culture as community too, like what does it mean to turn all of our brands into a position in Amazon search rankings? I don't know. It's like there's something very different about the culture of consumption. And so I think, to be frank, the sort of opportunities for political organizing or trying to work towards something different and better that I've seen in the world I research are pretty modest. But you see some of it. I see some of it in these extended family networks, and in some cases like diaspora networks and organizations that form around sellers trying either to source goods or just to gain bargaining power with Amazon, they hope in some cases, some of which call themselves co-ops. There are some social media groups where people who do this work are trying to communicate and organize. I can't help but think, like, wouldn't it be cool if these co-ops thought of themselves as somehow connected to the like unionizing FC workers and the logistics workers who increasingly also use this platform entrepreneur model that Amazon uses for its sellers. I think on a utopian horizon, the question would be, what are the other ways of accessing information and infrastructure and credit that are not dependent on Amazon that could be developed around online businesses? So I think, to state that question more broadly, for me, in this environment, it's just thinking about how to decouple the desire for autonomy and dignity and the ability to exercise creativity from these logics of digital capitalism that govern or drive a platform like Amazon, whose KPI, whose key key performance indicator whose goal is ultimately just to keep stuff moving and people buying stuff, because that's how they make money, when stuff moves. And that may be a way that someone can build a hustle for some time. I certainly think, it's not a KPI of humanity or democracy by any stretch. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And those are my thoughts on Amazon.
Ethan, you're going up to have slides?
I do have slides.
Okay.
I'll head over there.
All right. So as you're going up, let me pose this question to you. So just building on Moira's comments. So as we consider alternatives to today's big tech stacks, Amazon and others, what does it actually mean to build digital infrastructures that shape society according to a different kind of logic, one that is more civic-oriented or public-minded?
I think you should ask. So, first of all, what a treat. This is just a pleasure, and it's so wonderful to see so many old friends and new friends, and it's just been a fantastic event, and I'm really very grateful to the hosts. So I also want to say something that may be a little bit unexpected, which is that I'm actually feeling enormously grateful right now to Elon Musk. And I'm feeling grateful. I actually think he's done us two enormous favors, and I want to start by talking about these favors. The first one I think should be fairly obvious, which is that this notion that has dominated the tech industry as long as I've been in it, and as Sasha pointed out, that is a long, long time, is that the people running these companies are very special geniuses. That whether it's Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, there's an enormous amount invested in these hyper-privileged white men having a level of genius that is above superhuman intelligence. It is Tony Stark and Iron Man. And Elon Musk in the last 6 months or so has managed to demonstrate that that's a load of horse shit. And we owe him an enormous debt of gratitude for that. It's quite clear that that is not, in fact, what is going on in this particular case. It is a combination of privilege and a rigged system. But the other thing that I think is enormously helpful comes from that Doge in the top corner of the Twitter screen. So we should just talk about Doge very briefly. Doge was a really interesting Twitter meme a little more than 10 years ago. It was a Shiba Inu owned by someone in Japan. The photographs were largely taken in 2010. They became a thing on 4chan and then on Reddit to put funny captions on top of them. And in 2012, 2013, this was very, very funny. What then happened is maybe 5 or 6 years ago, someone decided that they would create the ultimate shitcoin. So this was a coin with no logic behind it, no backing, should have absolutely no value, but managed, because the internet is the internet, to end up with significant value behind it, because currency, of course, is a fiction and an illusion. Elon Musk decided to get involved with this, tweeted a lot about Dogecoin. There are now investors, and I use that advisedly, in Dogecoin who believe that Elon Musk has been manipulating the Dogecoin market. Again, phrases that I do not say especially comfortably. If you believe that Elon Musk is playing four-dimensional chess, what is actually going on with putting Doge on the front page of Twitter is that he is trying to distract from the lawsuit against him for manipulating Dogecoin, so that now when you search for Elon Musk and Doge, you get debates about what's going on Twitter, not about his involvement with market manipulation, something that he's quite experienced with. Here's what I want to say. Doge is a reminder that Elon Musk has taken $44 billion and turned a very helpful infrastructure, a public space, a space in which we have been having discussions about the future of democracy, and turned it into his own personal playground. And that personal playground is now labeling NPR as state-controlled media, which is causing NPR to no longer tweet. And if you were to reach out to Elon Musk's press and PR team about this, you will get an automated response which simply gives you a poop emoji. So the second favor Elon Musk has recently done us, as well as reminding us that billionaires are not in fact geniuses, is he has made it very, very clear that it was a really stupid idea to hand over elements of our public sphere to capricious billionaires. So what I am going to do here is put forward a manifesto that may get me in a little trouble with Sarah and some other folks here who caution us about tech determinism. Because I'm going to put forward a very specific technical vision, but I'm going to try to do it while surfacing some of the ideology behind it. And I'm also going to be shamelessly self-promoting work that we've been doing at my lab at UMass Amherst, the Initiative for Digital Public Infrastructure, which is a lab based around the idea that we need to think of our digital tools in terms of public goods and not in terms of things purely provided by the market. Our inspiration in many ways is the role that public media has in many advanced democracies, not ours, in which the government decides to allocate significant amounts of public money to ensure that we have a baseline level of factual information so that we can have a functioning democracy. And our response to this is to say perhaps we should do the same thing for the tools and spaces where we talk about the future. Our model for these futures is a model of a pluriverse. And you can find us talking about what we mean by pluriverse. We are using the Zapatista term. We're using it to mean a reality where many realities are possible. And what we mean in this case is on this particular issue, we are taking a non-abolitionist stance about social media, which is to say, I do not wish to wait for Facebook and Twitter and YouTube to go out of business before we build better digital media. But what I want to do at the same time is celebrate and learn from the numerous experiments that are happening out there. We wrote a little book during the pandemic called An Illustrated Field Guide to Social Media, where we took a deep look at platforms that are created to solve very specific problems. So this might be an archive of one's own, a women-led fan fiction collective who built their own space in which to exchange their work because they were facing copyright claims when they tried to do it on existing platforms. Or it might be the remarkable folks of Assembly 4 who built Switter, sex worker Twitter, when Sesta Fosta chased them off of platforms like Backpage and Twitter, and they still had real needs to protect themselves by discussing threats to their safety. There is a pluriverse of what we call VSOPs. We initially used the term very small online platform as an alternative to the EU's very large online platform. People have pointed out that an archive of one's own, which hosts 5 million people's work, is hardly very small. I am now thinking very specific online platforms. Basically, the idea being that we are interested in platforms that are not trying to be everything to everybody. They are trying to solve one problem very well. And one of the problems that we are trying to solve is how can you have a civil discussion within a small community and keep it focused on local civic issues. And we're doing this work in the city of Amherst, Massachusetts. We're doing it in partnership with our local community television station, Amherst Media. One of the great things about these organizations is that they are nonprofits. They exist in almost every mid-sized community, and they're desperately looking for a raison d'etre as we move into more of a digital space. And the raison d'etre in this case is, can we have a space where we talk about local politics, but where national level politics are explicitly off the table? So this is a heavily moderated, heavily scaffolded discussion space called Small Town. It's a Mastodon branch. It's available on GitHub if you want to play with it. We describe it as the world's most boring social network. The exciting conversations are about things like, should North Pleasant Street be one way? And if we make it one way, should we park parallel or should we back in? We should definitely back in. These are the sorts of conversations that we are having. I think these spaces are essential, they're critical, we need to study them more, and we need to experiment with them more, because they're wonderful laboratories for the sorts of experimentation that Nathan and others are talking about engaging within. Here is the trick. Because they are boring as dirt, you actually have to change the way in which people are encountering these networks. And that's where you need a client. You need something on your phone and on your laptop that lets you look at multiple social networks at the same time. We are human. You will always get distracted by TikTok. You need something that is going to remind you to pay attention to local civics, to pay attention to community organizing. You should be able to make the decision that that is important to you and you want it at the top of your feed. And at the same time, you should be able to make the decision that even if you continue to use Facebook, you should not have to give every mouse click and every interaction over to Facebook. You should control how that information is being handed to the platform. This is a product that we are releasing probably in the next month called Gobo. The first iteration of it is really simple. It is a client for Mastodon, Twitter, and Reddit. Now, Elon Musk has made our lives a lot harder in that we're now scraping Twitter rather than dealing with the API, but we'll get there. The next version of this gets really interesting because it starts introducing this idea of lenses. Lenses are algorithms that you have some control over that decide how your information is filtered and sorted. You can make the decision that I want to hear from a more diverse set of political points of view. And if you, like me, are a liberal New Englander, it might start filtering in more conservative voices. You could decide that you only want to be seeing fact-checked news, or that you only want to see cute photos of dogs. But the idea behind that is that you want to have a set of algorithms that have certain components to them. They're tunable. You can adjust the knobs on them. They're auditable. You can throw arbitrary content at them and see how it handles them and scores them. They're interoperable. They work across multiple different platforms, and they're understandable. We try hard to ensure that if they are black boxes we can ask and answer questions about. If you do this, you need a third component to your architecture. So these very small platforms, the loyal client, and the friendly neighborhood algorithm store. Because you need this for two things. You need it to sort the media that you are encountering, and these platforms are also going to need help. If you are starting a Mastodon server right now, you need to be thinking about child sexual abuse material. And you probably are not, or thinking about it hard enough. The only way that Facebook and Twitter and others are dealing with CSAM right now is millions of dollars of investment to try to figure out how they set up fingerprint databases around this. We need databases like that as a public resource. We need anti-spam databases as a public resource. We need to build these things so that we can use them both in the client and in the platform. So that's it. We're only trying to build three things. It's just that they're frickin' huge things and really challenging to build. And as I mentioned, we are trying to build these around a very, very different economic infrastructure. Rather than looking to see what will make the most money, in many cases we're looking to see how we do this cheaply. It turns out that running small social networks like Small Town for Amherst is on the lines of $500 a year from the technical point of view. Once you bring in the labor, whether it's volunteer or community labor, it's significantly more. But the actual fiscal barrier to running these services can be quite low. In some cases, you can actually build profitable businesses out of this. A. Kismet has a very successful business blocking blog spam. Block Party is a wonderful company started by Tracy Chow having to do with sharing blacklists for people on Twitter. These are for-profit businesses that are figuring out how to exist in this very different environment. So what I want to suggest to you is that another world absolutely is possible. The one that I am outlining here is not the only way to do it. It happens to be one that we are actually building. So we've already released Small Town. We will be releasing Gobo in the next month or so. We intend to continue iterating on these. One thing I would love to talk with people about is how we create funding for this. These are still very difficult, very challenging pieces of software to build. Just because they're not challenging to run doesn't mean that they're not challenging to make. They're enormously challenging to make. And one thing that VC does extremely well is it creates adventurous pools of capital that can allow you to build these things. We don't have particularly good mechanisms at this point to create those same adventurous models to move forward. But the point I want to make is this. I'm really sick of conversations that don't get beyond the critique and pointing out what's wrong that could be fixed through policy. We actually need to imagine and build a significantly better internet. That's what I'm trying to do. I would love to have ongoing conversations on that.
All right, so let's take a little trip from Amherst because In your book, Beyond the Valley, you seem to live this sort of dream life in your fieldwork of traveling all around the world and talking to the very best people. And so, in the course of that work, what did you learn about where people are prefiguring a democratic internet? What are they doing? What effects are their interventions having in people's lives? And crucially, what constraints do they face?
Yeah, thanks, Sanjay. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and I'm really honored to be part of today's event, really honored to be part of this panel, and I feel very excited right now, but I think Ethan often does that to me. So I've literally visited multiple Zapatista caracoles, or communities, and the phrase otro mundo es posible, another world is possible, is a phrase I've literally heard from masked leaders of juntas. And I think the only slight modification I would make to that expression is that otros mundos son posibles, other worlds are possible, y están aquí, they are here, they are here. It's all about where we look and shifting away from world making to world listening, which is really kind of where I ended my first book, Whose Global Village, with actually literally that quote and connecting to Subcomandante Marcos and so on. So I think, you're going to hear me be fairly philosophical and hyper-global in these brief remarks today. And I think I just want to start by mentioning something that I think pretty much all of us believe, or at least I feel like we believe here in this temporary community, temporary autonomous zone that we are occupying, which is it's about technology, but it's also not about technology, right? It's about what values we believe in. It's about what kind of world we wish to live in. It's a planetary question, really. It's a question of compassion, of justice, of recognition, right? And I think that recognizing that technology expresses not merely the rational mind, but the poetic, the aesthetic mind, and also it can be expressive of the heart, is extremely important to me right now. And I think that vision is one that I feel likely drives most of the presentations I've seen today. I can feel that, and certainly drives all of my work. Because I think what we recognize now is that technologies of different types, including internet technologies, are mediating forces of life, right? The containment, the incarceration of life, but also the futures of life. And specifically, the ways in which technology directs or encloses or incarcerates opportunities we have toward life relates to both the concept of the necropolitical, the politics of death, as well as the noopolitical, which is a concept that Foucault raised at a certain point, along with biopolitical, which is about sharing knowledge in a very global sense to contest power. Now, note the term that I used, necropolitical. Many of you, of course, know of the classic work, at this point, classic work of our colleague, beloved colleague, Achille Bembe, from Cameroon originally, but based in Johannesburg, on his work on the necropolitical, right? The politics of death, whose lives matter, what aspects of life matter. So all of these thoughts were sort of circling and bubbling around in my mind after I published my last book, Beyond the Valley, in October 2019. And, I think we all know what happens shortly after that with the pandemic. And that got me into this realm of thinking quite deeply about questions of life itself and where technologies are and are not heading in relation to the re-embracing of life. Okay, so, these are questions, of course, that philosophers who probably many of us admire have asked for a very long time. Cornel West asked over 20 years ago when Race Matters came out, what does it mean to be human? And to that question, I think we can also ask the question of what does it mean to be alive, right? And I think that those questions are critically important with the emergence of technologies that replace human life in a way that's really about the non-living. That's specifically an example like ChatGPT would be that. Behavioral mimicry that obfuscates and flattens and erodes human creativity, let alone human intelligence. or the and the economics of all of these questions. So what I want to do is just sort of talk to you a little bit about what I'm working through in relation to a lot of global DIY partnerships that I've had with various communities and social movements. I feel like you kind of maybe alluded to it, Sanjay. I've definitely been having a blast the last like 20 years of my life. And you know, I was in the middle of the Arab Spring for 3 years. So like what you all were talking about earlier, I met Nathan doing an interview about the Arab Spring back in 2011, right after I had come back from Tahrir. So I think the way I'm thinking about these questions of power and voice and our planet in relation to these questions of technology, because I think all these questions we are asking and answering about technology are about these much bigger issues at this point, right? Because our lives are so mediated by data, by quantification, by technological systems of different types. And a concept that Ashil and I were talking through, I did my sabbatical mainly with him in Johannesburg, is, and some of you might be familiar with his work on this subject, is about borders, the restriction of circulation and movement. And I think on an obvious level, we can see that in the non-digital realm, right? Like who gets to move in the world? Whose voices get to move in the world? A question that Ethan was pushing a long time ago when he started Global Voices, right, with Rebecca McKinnon. And the question of movement, I think, is extremely important, right? Look at who gets to cross the Mediterranean and who doesn't, right? Sub-Saharan Africans are not. That's a border. It's a necropolitical border. It's a border of death, right? The United States border has been essentially, and I've seen this firsthand, and I can tell you all crazy stories of this. The United States southern border has essentially been extended to Chiapas. I've seen firsthand the arrest of Central American migrants, South American migrants in Chiapas. Chiapas is the bordering state to Guatemala in the Lacandon jungle there, right? So there's an extension of bordering that occurs in a physical sense. And you know, we can ask questions, right? Like for refugees and the migration of refugees today, you know, it's great that Ukrainian refugees are being accepted in other parts of the world, but what about our Yemeni or Somali brothers and sisters, or our Bangladeshi brothers and sisters, right? So there's real questions about the racial aspects of movement as well. So I start by talking about this now, you know, I'm starting by talking about this now in a physical sense, but now let's move to the technological domain, which we know erodes and displaces and conflates with physical space, physical movement, embodiment, and so on. There are a number of borders that are being erected, and then what I want to do very quickly at the end is talk about some of the ways to destroy those borders, okay? One is the bordering of our lives as being represented by quantification. Like, I'm not really sure every aspect of my identity could somehow be represented through a discrete set of numbers that are being collected about me by some person who has no clue about social or cultural life and is ordering my life accordingly, right? So this is one huge, I think, violation of life. Another is the idea that we're creating, that technologies are often atomizing us and individuating us. So in other words, we are often placed as subject to various systems that individualize us rather than recognize our profound interrelationships, how, you know, the well-being of David, for example, is connected to my own well-being, right? And so I think that this is really important because many of the systems that we are now bowing to and that are ordering our lives are constructing and manipulating and providing us with pathways based on quantification and individuation. There's a lot of good research out there that shows how game theoretic models, prisoner's dilemma models, rugged individualist, hyper-competitive, your you know, Ethan wins, I loses kind of assumptions are embedded in various types of systems, right? So even if it's not social media or us facing a computer, our banks are following such a logic. Other systems that are using quantification and individuation are actually ordering our lives in a model of human life that is actually, I would say, completely untrue and destructive for our species and this planet. We are building systems that ignore externalities. I heard Nathan earlier give a shout out to Eleanor Ostrom, right? Like, The idea of the externality being ignored in these kind of tight, individualized computing systems is a whole other problem. We're seeing bordering of systems that are taking away our creativity, right? Like, why did I think what I just thought right now? Why did I choose to express what I just thought in the words I chose to express them with? What is creativity? Do we really have answers to any of those questions? And now we have systems like GPT that are totally poser. It's a poser system. That's what I call it, a poser. It's posing. Remember we used to call people posers? It's a poser. It's mimicking, based on pattern recognition, human expressive activity, but it lacks any aspect of what makes us intelligent, even if we were to assume we are rational, individual, maximizing beings, which we're not, right? So other borders, the border of space, right? Space is a place where Elon and Jeff get to go, but as Gil Scott Heron reminded us, and also, of course, more recently, Tribe Called Quest reminded us with their song, The Space Program, we stuck here. That's literally what they said. We're stuck here, right? So space becomes that too, rather than space as relational, as many indigenous cultures, even astrology folks believe in space as part of us, right? So the point I guess I want to make is that many of these systems we think of as inclusive or relational, including market systems themselves. It was great to hear Sandeep speak earlier. I was just getting a lot out of what people were sharing. These are not open markets or free markets we're describing. I have had, when I worked on the Sanders campaign, on the Green New Deal, the digital parts of that, we actually were in contact with, and I was in contact with Yanis Varoufakis, the former, many of you know him. And what Yanis basically describes these techno-capital systems as no longer about profitability. They're about valuation. You can think about a company like Uber, which has been valuated at certain amounts but has barely been profitable. Or another point during the pandemic when the stock market valuation was at its highest and the GDP was at one of its lowest. So we're actually talking about a zombification of capital. That's another border, right? So he describes this as techno-feudalism, and kind of our relationship to Amazon as a feudal relationship. And I think these are all important critiques that then we have to look at. So what I'm trying to talk about is the expressive aspects of our technological datafied lives, and then we have to think about the ways we want to do away with it, right? So there's the real question, right? So we've heard from great thinkers here today in policy. I mean, my talk is just basically riffing on what you all are saying right now with my own opinions, right? We've talked about social movements. When I worked on the Sanders campaign, I worked on policy and as a national surrogate, we kept using expressions like not me, us, and I remember, Nathan, when we met, it was right before Occupy, and then you got very involved in that. It was like 99% and the 1%. So these are all approaches, kind of approaches of collective identification that are inclusive of other human beings, are global in their scope, and at times even inclusive of non-human nature. And I think that way of looking at things is critical. So now to the kind of fieldwork I do, some of you know this, I do like DIY community-based fieldwork with partnerships with either social movements or community organizations around the world that are trying to really that are trying to fight for something else, pushing for something else, whether it's the Arab Spring or Zapatismo or the field work I've been doing. And some of you know the organization Rizomatica based in Oaxaca, who are responsible for hundreds now well over 100 DIY, indigenous-driven, built, designed cell phone networks. Again, why did they do that? Well, it came out of this community radio history. And now they're trying to express these ideas into the Amazon with land protectors, which I can talk about if any of you are curious. So these are examples, DIY networks, and then in a very unequal world, when we build technologies also that are necropolitical, right, like planned obsolescence, that's designed to die, what are people doing in open-air markets around the world? Because we live in an unequal world, a deeply unequal world. Right, so I've been doing field work in Mercato, which is in Ethiopia's biggest open-air market. Yeah, it's fun, and also been working with incredible DIY innovators, entrepreneurs in places like Kenya who are taking waste of all types and regenerating it. You know, this term regenerative has become a neoliberal World Economic Forum term. Some of us dance a little in those worlds. I do a little. But it's, but okay, you know, what are they doing? They're taking waste and creating new life out of it. Why? Because you gotta hustle, right? They call it jua kali in Swahili, hot sun, you know? Soldering gun, a table, I'm just gonna rig stuff. I'm gonna just make it. I'm gonna make it and remake it, right? And I've literally seen, you know, in Ethiopia, the coffee's like better there than almost anywhere in the world. I've seen people taking old Nescafe plastic bottles that were in the trash, taking off the Nescafe label, polishing it up, and selling it to people who are pouring actually good coffee in those plastic bottles. So there's wonderful recursive practices here. Or in Kenya with Africa Born 3D, taking like electronic waste of all types from old photocopiers, Xerox copiers, combining that with plastic bottles, and using plastic bottles, convection and conduction to print the filament, to make filament out of plastic trash, using the old circuits to build the circuit boards of the new 3D printers, and then printing thousands of microscopes that are now in the hands of East African youth all over the continent who never could have afforded it otherwise. Building 3D printers that are outperforming American, Chinese ones because of the design expertise of knowing who you are and where you are and building it accordingly. So I guess what I want to get at, I mean, I can tell you a million more stories. I've been writing about movements, networks, alternative trajectories for technologies of all kinds. These days, you can hear my philosophical, spiritual side here very deeply, but I'm even asking questions about what do we mean by technology, right? Like, can we, and the question I guess I want to get to is, can we hammer home and emphasize and generate energy and movements out of looking at experiments and examples of technologies of all kinds that recognize we're not in it alone and we can't be in it alone. This whole aloneness is a big lie and myth that they created to individuate us, and I don't know if the intention was to make us all like rugged individualists, but it's failing, right? And so the question that Achille has been hammering home on and that I've been picking up on is, in what is a planetary vision, a new utopian vision, you know, like a planetary vision that looks at the future, looks at our planet as what is and what we want to create. And so for me, these questions of repair, taking things that were paired and repairing them, right? Repair, care and compassion, movements and identities, and really relinking us with other forms of life on this planet, and then thinking about technology accordingly. To me, that's the path forward that I'm very inspired by. So these are ideas that have been percolating in my mind. I mean, I just came from about 8 months sabbatical. That was fun in India and Africa, and in Latin America. So these are the parts of the world where I've been looking at this, and these are the stories I'm hearing. So far from a mere kind of concept or sexy like lefty philosophy, pluriverse is an actual practice enacted by people in places who believe in their lives and their families and their communities and the land from which they come. And so I think that I wanted to just share those thoughts with the mix. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Moira. So I want to ask one, maybe two questions, and then open it up. And I want to start by interrogating the broader politics at play here. So how, for instance, do aspirations for a post-capitalist internet connect with other movement formations, whether organized labor, Sunrise and the Green New Deal, migrant justice, reparations, et cetera? Matt, I know you talked about the anti-monopoly movement, and so maybe we can dig a little deeper there and move down.
I'm just really inspired by the anti-monopoly movement. I think developing a coherent and very clearly communicable critique of capitalism is, very powerful. I mean, we mentioned the Bernie Sanders movement. I think that's a clear example of like potential popular politics that can come out of this. And I think Sarah mentioned earlier, like maybe technology isn't the main thing, and I think I tend to agree with that. I mean, I kind of wrestled over whether to like try to make that point more forcefully. I didn't know if I would get thrown out of the building or something. But it's a conference about the internet. But I come from Ohio, and there's a lot of political strife that's impacting people in very direct and material ways, and I think we need to be very strategic about aligning politics of technology with these kind of broader systems, and that's something that I'm hoping to learn more about, and I think we need to work much harder on.
So one thing we've learned an enormous amount about through the Arab Spring, through a number of online movements, including the Zapatista movement that's been invoked several times today, is that these tools can be enormously powerful for movement synchronization and debate and sort of learning, particularly from geographically dispersed groups of people. I think one thing that's super interesting is that movements also need to recruit, they also need to interrogate, they need to interact with other forces in society. And so one of the things that I'm actually very worried about as we're looking at the loss of Twitter and sort of other online spaces is the loss of what some people have started calling the big room. So if you think about the Me Too movement, if you think about Black Lives Matter, movement for Black Lives, you've seen in many cases these movements emerge with a small group, starting with an in-group conversation, but then essentially seizing and challenging the narrative. And that ability to theoretically speak to 300 million people and essentially say, hey, we're going to talk about this now. This is a really good time to talk about police violence against people of color. This is a really good time to talk about an epidemic of sexual abuse, and we're going to steer the narrative in another direction. That's really hard to do within insular small groups. You need the big groups as well. And so part of the reasons we're pushing for a pluriverse vision, that we're pushing for big rooms as well as small rooms, that we're interested in federation as well as sort of networks based around solidarity, is the ability for some of these other movements to both have the ability to retreat to spaces and find solidarity and comfort. This is one of the things that I find so valuable about Charlton's work. Some of his work on Black software really looks at the importance of having a space where you can be yourself, you can relax, you can assume that other people have the same assumptions that you are, and that's part of what allows you as a movement actor to go out and challenge people within those bigger rooms. So finding, ultramundos, que están aquí, finding those other worlds that are here, both the big ones and the small ones, seems really helpful.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think I kind of alluded to it, but, I've had the blessing of being in several, part of several different social movements, in many cases because I personally was, involved in them. And I think the thing I want to mention, and I was sort of trying to allude to, is it's not merely like what I'm paying attention to here are not merely movements that are sort of explicitly about a political vision or goal, which I have had some experience working with and within, but also larger scale cultural and social and I guess we could call them environmental practices, but I would almost call them like cosmological or just life practices. And so, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but about over 20 countries now in the African continent, for citizens of those countries, they can travel between those countries without a visa, right? There are movements afoot that are kind of DIY of sharing, that you see, like swapping ringtones would just be like a fun example, like Sahara what was that called? Sahara cell phones tape? I thought you guys might know. So just these kinds of, there are initiatives underway because the world is shifting and changing, and sometimes it's also about losing sight of the dominant frame, which I think it's important for us to focus on and fight against, but also looking at practices that are emerging that contest that.
And I think also the anti-monopoly movement, which I get excited about in some ways and feel maybe has some limitations in other ways, but I also have been, in my particular research, living very close to like the empirical everyday lives of these folks in a way that I feel like sometimes blocks me from seeing the bigger view, but maybe also Ramesh is helping me see ways it's a strength. And I think there's something interesting about this sort of anti-tech turn, or this tech critical turn that's happened in the past like 5 to 7 years, where I feel like 5 years, I've lost track of time, but approximately 5 years ago, like most people thought Facebook was good, and now even people who don't think about these things for a living seem to generally think Facebook is bad in some ways. And I wonder if there's a way that momentum or a certain kind of critique then opens other possibilities for thinking about like what other kinds of systems maybe are problematic. And I think, as I mentioned in my remarks, that where I'm actually seeing people try to work together in the world I'm looking at, it's like very small scale things of people trying, pooling resources or sharing information about how they think this algorithm works and so on. But I wonder what it looks like when this labor movement around the fulfillment centers and this broader critique of techno-capitalism, or the system we live in, links up in people's minds with these much more practical, everyday strategies that they've tried to figure out to navigate their lives and livelihoods.
I do want to ask a follow-up to that as far as, and this actually gets back to something Sandeep was talking about during the earlier panel, in terms of recovering political economy in this, because the part of the tension here is that the development of digital technologies occurs in this intensely commodified and financialized context, corporate R&D disciplined by capital markets. And so in a post-commercial internet, what do capital-intensive development projects look like?
So, so let me start by challenging that and essentially saying that corporate R&D is incredibly boring in many cases, in this field at least. An enormous amount of what you see going on is feature for feature copying. Just watching Instagram and YouTube try to figure out how to catch up with TikTok in just the most blunt, boring, straightforward ways. It's really kind of pathetic, actually. The interesting stuff is happening in tiny subcommunities. It's happening on individual subreddits where people are coming up with different governance rules and essentially putting together something like Change My Mind, or models like Explain It Was iOS 5, and structuring different forms of conversations. It's happening in some of these very small or very specific social networks that we're studying, where people have very specific needs and are building different models around them. One of my very favorites on this is one that a queer friend of mine in Bahrain has built called Awa, which is a space for LGBTQ teens, youth, 20-somethings in the Persian Gulf, where it's incredibly dangerous to have your real-world identity associated with queerness. And so creating an online space that's both very intimate, but is also completely free of PII. So the first thing that I would say is I actually think looking at the big economies for creativity is the wrong place to look. What's useful about the big economies is scaling and maintenance. So we've just had this wonderful illustration of why maintenance is important for everyone who uses Twitter. It just doesn't work very well anymore. And it doesn't work very well anymore because it's really hard to fire 3/4 of your staff and end up only with people who are essentially prisoners of visas and have the company still work. But maybe if we reverse this whole mythos that these white tech bros, of which, by the way, it's the social caste I come from, that we are somehow the creative geniuses, and instead, maybe focus on asking us to build and maintain systems over time, which are built by the incredible creative diversity of the mass of humanity lucky enough to be on the internet finding different ways to organize themselves. that'd be a good use for some of those skills.
I just wanted to say, I mean, to Ethan's point about tech bros not being geniuses, right? I mean, the question is, the subsidies are there. The question is, who have we been subsidizing and who can we subsidize, right? I mean, it comes back to big, hard policy questions. But I mean, the dot-com bubble basically said, no one has to make any actual profits. Go see what you can do, and the investment kind of, carried things along until it didn't. And then we had, extremely low interest rates after the housing crisis, right? I mean, it's been free money for 20 years. So, if we could somehow direct some of those subsidies that are relevant in telecom and are relevant all the way back to, radio broadcasting, right? And even farther back than that into newspapers and postal subsidies, and I'm treading into Victor's territory a little bit, but, find a way to redirect those to, to other folks and other kinds of projects, seems a worthwhile effort.
Yeah, I wanted to mention one thing quickly. I think one thing I was hearing across the different talks, both here with our panel and earlier today, were like two major vectors of outcome. One is occupy your own space, self-organize, keep it small, introduce alternatives, introduce safe spaces for care and solidarity. Mutual aid is a term that's been used several times today. That's one. And the other is, and this is something, it's a different, kind of bag of trouble, but it's trying to change power, and transform and contest power. And so, I have been doing field work in different parts also of South America. I was just in Colombia recently, which has, an Afro-Caribbean feminist as its vice president. Is it merely optics? Hard to know, but Francia comes directly out of the social movements that my friends there have been part of for decades, So you can see the emergence on the state level, not that they aren't corrupt, of social democracies, and we saw it in Uruguay, we've seen it in Peru's a mess right now because of this coup, Bolivia, Chile, etc., right? So you see those sort of things happen. And then, I think about this a lot in terms of when we were working on the Sanders campaign, the 2020 campaign, there was a concern that Bernie himself said it to everybody. He's like, they're going to take it away from us, and this was in Venice Beach. There were 20,000 people there. We thought we were like hot stuff. And they're going to take it. So the question of how you deal with the institutional or deeper modes of co-opting a movement, or in this case a campaign, and that created a fissure in the campaign. Some people joined Biden-Harris, some people didn't, and and what to make out of actually trying to challenge power on a deepened institutional level, with things like the Sunrise Movement, the movement for Black Lives, all these movements, right? And I think that can be extremely frustrating, but I think it's the other layer that can be overwhelming, but needs to be balanced out by the safe spaces, by the intranets, by the community networks, by the platform cooperatives, all of it, So.
Great. Why don't we group a few questions together from the audience for folks? Anjali?
Yeah, hi. Thank you guys so much. This was really exciting and generative. I have a question that's specifically related to small town and sort of how you're conceptualizing that. And explicitly extricating sort of local from national. I'm thinking about kind of the struggles of journalism and social media, mirroring one another in terms of the boundaries or the boundary breaking of what happens when the local becomes the national, and sort of if you can speak more to the protection of the space, the insular nature of the space, and what it means when those boundaries are sort of pushed or completely broken.
I really appreciate, particularly the way in which this conversation got more international, because a lot of the discussion so far has been about national policy. One of the perils there is that we have the privilege and responsibility of regulating these big tech platforms in the US, but in some ways anything we do there becomes a form in one way or another of digital colonialism. And so I'm wondering about thoughts, we've laid out some ideas for a kind of national politics and as well as more regional politics of transition and reform, and kind of policy strategies have come out. But I'm wondering if we could also do that at a more transnational level and think about what is the basis of a transnational politics of democratizing the internet.
Thank you all so much for coming and talking today. I think I was struck just as you're going through this like really, hard question to answer, right? Of like, what comes next? What would it look like? I was really struck by how much some of the conversation resembled things that have already come to pass, right? Like these visions of the internet from the late 90s and the early 2000s of like smaller communities online who, maybe like just hop on the internet to like see if they can find a couch to stay on in another city when they're visiting. Obviously, that didn't work in a lot of ways, and that's not to say that the visions that are being presented here, will suffer a similar fate. But I guess I'm just curious what you all think about why that vision of the internet failed at that time and what we could learn about it looking forward.
Great, take it in any order, Joe.
Now, I just want to say something really interesting, but I'm interested in your opinion about the discussion, for example, in Europe. The valorization of the GDPR, the Digital Services Act, the Marketing Services Act. The Europeans think they're headed in the right direction, but it's all about essentially reinforcing a marketing perspective within a particular set of constraints, setting up guardrails around marketing rather than looking in a different direction. And they're basically telling their societies that this is the way to go, and that this is to essentially reinforce that attitude. There's nothing about any of those acts that raise any of the questions you guys have raised. So how do you deal with, I haven't heard a word about that kind of infrastructure that is being set in the kind of stone for the next decade.
Just dive in, we got like 7.5 minutes.
We can take a little more time. Yeah, go for it.
So I'd love to take the question on small town first, and thank you very much for that. There's a bunch of research out there on the local problem. So often local focused social networks are actually some of the nastiest and most vicious. Nextdoor in particular has a terrible reputation for being horrifically racist. There's a couple things that you can do. The first thing is don't let police run your social networks, right? Nextdoor comes out of the paradigm of the neighborhood watch. It is fundamentally based around a paradigm of violence against people of color. Some of the paradigms that work significantly better work from this idea that, maybe we're not all going to speak freely all the time. Maybe we're actually going to pretty carefully moderate that conversation to try to make sure that it's inclusive and fair. So Small Town does two things that are a bit unusual. We queue posts. Everything is reviewed by Moderator. You don't post freely on the network. And we got that from Front Porch Forum in Vermont, which has been doing it very successfully with email lists all around that state. The second thing is we do an enormous amount of what we call scaffolding, which actually looks a whole lot like local journalism. So before we write about housing in Amherst, which is what we're working on right now, we research it the same way that we would research a story for the local newspaper so that we have facts and so that we can prompt people for it. And in the same way, when I was a 15-year-old reporter and I would go out and do person on the street interviews, those are the sorts of prompts that we use within the social network, both to get people involved and also to give a sense for what's appropriate within it. Let me also take a crack at some of the questions around globalism and around Europe. There is a paradigm that I'm starting to see. It's mostly coming out of the Netherlands, but it's really based around this idea that what Europe could bring to this conversation is not just regulating the crap out of US providers, which may actually be a worthwhile thing to do, but a model for internet spaces based around the notion of public goods. So I wrote a paper with Jose van Dijk and Gertjan Bogart from a Dutch public broadcaster recently for ACMD.gov, which talks about values-led organizations, organizations that are led by a charter of values, and how to build software that's consistent with those values, and the idea that those organizations are common enough in Europe that they might actually be a market segment capable of creating those spaces. And we're starting to see, mostly through an NGO called Public Spaces, some of this software coming into play. There's a project called Pub Hubs, which is essentially a replacement product for Facebook groups, which operates in a decentralized manner and lets you, for instance, have a meeting between all the parents who have kids in the 8th grade in the Utrecht schools. And part of what's interesting about it is that it is run by the school, and it actually takes privacy very seriously. It uses a very strange identity system called IRMA, where you can show the credential to prove that you have a kid in the Utrecht public schools, but you don't actually have to give your name. So there are things coming out of European value systems that take privacy way more seriously than we do in the US, and assume public goods and public services, which we evidently stopped doing sometime in the 1970s, that I actually think are a really interesting thing some of the Europeans are bringing to this debate.
Yeah, my point though, Ethan, was that they
I got
still
a
at the core of the
crosstalk.
Europeans feel advertising is where it should be at the core of the internet.
Sorry, I just for time's sake.
Go ahead, sure.
Yeah.
Oh. I think the question that I would respond to most directly would be this question of the global or the transnational, and I don't want to evade the question by saying, again, it's just very hard, and particularly in the current environment with US-China hostilities being what they are, it's very, very hard. I have become interested in this idea, and part of why I was drawn to Amazon Marketplace as a research site, you know, the Great Firewall, perhaps our own anti-TikTok regulation, who knows, draws really strong boundaries in certain ways on communication across, you know, between the United States and China, and in a way, we communicate through commerce in some strange way. Like, to think of these objects, like every object probably, or 90% of the objects in our homes maybe have been made in this other place. And so I think I'm not sure what is to be done, but thinking about how channels of communication could be built around that is an interesting question. I mentioned to you last night in another strain of my research, I've done some work on tech worker organizing and tech workers in the US and China communicating via GitHub, which was like small but felt promising at the time. So I think there's so much contact and yet so little communication. For me, the question is what kinds of infrastructures or tools could be made or could be hijacked, like GitHub, for the purposes of facilitating communication among people whose interests may be more similar than they think. Although in some ways they're also pitted against each other within this infrastructure that we have.
Yeah, my main thought in relation to like some of those questions put together is to think about tech in alignment with globally distributed movements that of even whether they are actually actively connected or whether they're occurring in kind of multiple locales concurrently, and build tech as a sort of a vessel of production and amplification of those movements. Because I think one of the main challenges we have as progressives, I'm curious what you think, Nathan, is you know, we're concerned that these different movements that we're all about end up kind of also being individuating, right? Like the Sunrise Movement and the movement for Black Lives are integrally connected, right? Just like problems are connected, the pandemic and climate crisis are interconnected, right? And the question of human habitability on this planet are connected. So if I think about what are those kind of globally distributed movements, whether they're kind of in contact with one another or not, I think about here in this country, the movement for worker power. It's so awesome, right? I work with Faz. Some of you know him, or you knew him from More Perfect Union, right? I was following a bunch of you on Twitter, and I saw they follow a bunch of people here too. And, you know, that's a great thing. I think there's concerns in other parts of the world the environmental movements, right? And concerns about that, especially amongst younger peoples. So those are a couple of them, right? I think the widespread consensus around the planet that the status quo when it comes to, I guess we can call it surveillance capitalism, is bad. So it's like, what emerges in a way that can be an interface between those movements? I think that's a key thing. And then who are our front, our faces, our people in front who can help us lead the way? Whether it doesn't have to be Bernie, it could be anyone. So but they have to channel that populism that is in those movements, that energy. It's a kinetic energy that has to be transmuted into something, and the technologies need to facilitate the kineticism of it.
So I think the one question that went unaddressed was Brendan's. And I think it's actually a very good lead-in to Ben's keynote, which is, commodification often appears like this one-way ratchet. And so even as the historical process behind the internet's commercialization was so contingent, once the institutions are in place and path dependencies get embedded, they become extremely difficult to dislodge. So as we look at today's conjunctures, right, the things that aren't fully formed, how do we not repeat those same mistakes? How do we win?
Oh, I thought this was a rhetorical question for Ben. How do we not repeat this?
Get the money right. Get the money right. We picked up a weird, strange, deeply dangerous model for funding the last 20 years of technological innovation in this country. And, it's a bad model in a whole lot of ways. Whether public financing is actually a viable model for some of the things I'm talking about, it needs to be on the table. Cooperatives need to be on the table. Volunteerism and mutual support needs to be on the table. But you can't just find one way to pay for things. And you're going to end up with the problem. So, many of those models, like Couchsurfing, succeeded. It's Airbnb. Right? And it lacks everything that was cool about Couchsurfing because all of those funky rough edges were shaved off to make it work within a venture capital model. But that's what happened. Like all of that cool shit from the late 90s and early 2000s morphed into its most marketable form and made billions of dollars for a very small group of people who have then avoided paying taxes on it. And that was a shitty way to organize an economy, and we shouldn't do that again.
All right. Please join me in thanking